Good morning, it's Trevor with Loluna Barbecue. Today we're going to be doing a pork belly. So this is a beautiful pork belly. This one I just got from Costco, so don't feel like you gotta try to source some fancy thing for this. Most Costco's do carry pork belly regularly these days. So this one is skin off. This is a full belly and just really nice. I do have kind of a little bit of a thin section in here. It even has a little bit of silver skin on it. I'm just going to leave that. I'd rather not. I don't have any other use currently for the rest of this meat. So I'm just going to cook it up, and if there's kind of some thin crispy parts, I'm sure they'll be delicious too. So what we're going to want to do on this, again, this is skin off, but I do still like to score this part of the fat just to help it render out a little bit better. It's also going to help get the spices down into the meat. When you slice it up, you'll kind of see those penetration points of the rub that we put on there and of the sauce that we're going to put in the wrap. Make sure to stick around for that part because we are going to do something real nice and special with that. So let's start off by scoring this skin. Not going too deep here, just kind of run your knife across nice and light. I'm doing pretty large sections here, not really fine ones. If this was skin and you wanted like good crispy skin, you'd want to have these be 1-inch squares, maybe even a little bit smaller than that, but with it just being this fat, we don't really need to get all fancy with that. So again, scoring this both ways. And now we're ready to put on some rub. So today what we're doing with our rub, we're keeping it pretty simple. We've got some fine sea salt from Redmond real salt, and then just some kosher salt we're going to be putting on there. I want to get that rubbed in really well. And then here we have a fresh ground mix of some coriander, just about 3 corianders. I will put the recipe down below. Some cardamom, fresh ground. Also some fresh ground clove and some fresh ground black pepper. So that's essentially what's in here. I did put a teeny bit of sumac in there as well. I'll just put that again down in the description. And then I've got a little bit of Hungarian paprika just to add a little bit of color. It probably isn't going to contribute much flavor at all. Maybe a little bit of spice from that, but again, mostly that's a color thing. So starting with our finer salt, especially on this side, we're going to do kind of healthy amount there, and we really want to try to get that in between all of these cracks. You can kind of bend the roast to help you get it in there. But we really want to get that one worked in because that's kind of our base layer that's going to bring out that savory, porky goodness. Now let's hit that with our kosher salt. Some of this is going to stay fairly crystalline, which is going to give us like a nice texture, little bursts of flavor in there. Again, really kind of rubbing it in good in this. And then I'm going to actually do the paprika, since again we're kind of focused on color with this. Try to get that rubbed around fairly evenly. Kind of go back anywhere where you missed a little bit. And now on to our actual spice mix, and this smells amazing. Coriander, oh my gosh, such a nice seasoning. It's something that I think is a super underrated rub, at least in like American cooking and barbecue. Obviously in Eastern cooking and in Indian food it's a big one, but coriander is amazing. It's really floral, kind of sweet. And then cardamom is one that a lot of times you'll even find in desserts. So there's such a good sweetness. If you got a whiff of this thing, you'd be in heaven. It's just amazing. So again, this is all freshly ground spices. Link in the description. Not a ton of black pepper, but there is a fair amount in there. And now we're going to go to the other side. I'm not going to worry that much about the sides on this, just because it is pretty thin. If I was trying to do this for something fancy like a competition, maybe I'd worry a little bit about that, but in this setting, I don't worry hardly about sides at all on things like ribs and fish, different things like that, just because it's not a big deal unless you're worried about that even distribution. You want plenty of salt on there, just really brings out those flavors. If you didn't want to do these in layers, you could pretty much just mix your rub all together. I do recommend, at least on the scored side, trying to get that salt as deep down in those grooves as possible. But again, if you're not that worried about layering it, you can just kind of make one rub with this. Obviously with the fresh ground spices, you're going to get a lot better flavor. Just like the difference between using, you know, a store-bought pre-ground pepper and then getting like a nice fresh ground black pepper. The flavors are just that much more fresh and intense. But feel free to, if you don't have a spice grinder, you can always just use a blender, but again, feel free to buy those pre-ground spices and it's still going to turn out great. So this thing looks and smells beautifully. We've got behind me our Jambo Pits Backyard smoker preheating. We are going to throw this on for several hours in the beginning, probably 3 to 4 hours. That's going to get us up to maybe about 165, 170 degrees. But more importantly, we're looking for a color consistency and then also some of that fat to be rendered. Basically, when you touch it with a gloved hand or a regular finger and the rub doesn't come back on you, also you're going to actually feel the meat start to give away rather than spring back. That's what we're going to be looking for. So again, we're preheating here. We're going to go to about 275 degrees today. I am burning oak splits on the pit today. We may mix some hickory in there too, just because that's just kind of what I've got going on. Okay, we've got the Jambo fully preheated here. We're ready to throw it on. So we're sitting about 275, 280 right now. With this particular smoker, we're going to put the meat fat side up. I don't really want to go too crazy into the fat side up or down argument because it's a whole thing. But really what you want to use that fat for a lot of times is protecting your meat from the heat. So in this particular pit, the heat comes up, it goes over the top of the meat and then goes out. There's not a ton of radiant heat exposure in this particular pit. So just a quick rundown on that. If you do have a pellet cooker especially, I do always recommend doing fat side down. You do get a lot of radiant heat coming off of the tuning plates of those that can burn the bottom of your meat. Anyway, for my particular smoker and this, I'm going to put the fat side up. And we'll get her thrown on the smoker here. This is kind of a floppy piece of meat. You just kind of have to reorient it all when you get it into the chamber. I'm going to go right about there. I'm probably going to move this around a few times as well, so at least kind of turning it and moving it just to kind of help with some of that even cooking. I will be also spritzing about every hour. Not sure, we'll probably do like some pineapple juice and some apple juice. You can even just do some water just to kind of help keep some moisture in there. So anyway, stick with us and we'll get her done. Everything looking pretty good. We're about 2 hours into the cook here. We're starting to get a pretty nice color. One thing I wanted to point out, if you notice from some of the previous shots, maybe I'll put a little highlight in here, but we had a kind of a settling point in this area here, and then kind of another one in the middle. I really didn't want that juice that was building up there to affect the color and the bark on this. So a little tip you can do on that, you can either take something like pieces of a potato, pieces of an onion, or in this case I just have like some smaller wood chunks that are kind of bottom of the barrel type of stuff for for some of the other cookers that I'll cook on. And I sort of just kind of shimmed up the meat. So I did a kind of a rotation and a couple things with the meat here, some spritz and everything. And then I took some of these thinner little pieces and chunks and put them under those low points. A nice trick for various types of and cuts of meat, ribs and brisket, a couple of those, anything that's kind of flat and large like this. If you get those settling points and you don't want your bark to be ruined or affected in that area, just kind of shim it up a little bit and even it all out. When I'm doing these pork bellies, I don't actually leave a probe in the meat. I actually just use my thermopen and just go around and kind of check the temperature. It's really tricky to get a good temperature reading if you're going into fat, and there's a ton of fat in this, so leaving a probe in these, sometimes you can get a bad reading. So if you do leave the probe in, that's fine. I would just recommend, as you're getting to those temperatures, use your instant read to kind of check around multiple parts of the meat. So anyway, this happens to be right where we want it to be for wrapping. So we're gonna get the foil here and we'll show you that process. Okay, so we're coming up on about 3.5 hours. This pork belly has reached an internal temperature of about 165, 170 degrees in some places. We're ready to pull it off, and we are going to wrap this up. So today we are going to be using actual aluminum foil. You just want to make sure to wrap it really tight. The bark and everything should come back to life once we do our basting stage at the end. If you really wanted to do butcher paper, you could on this. That'd be fine. I'd maybe even recommend doing sort of the hybrid method where you have the aluminum foil on the bottom and everything else wrapped in that butcher paper. You want to retain as much of that moisture as possible. We're really wanting to render all that fat out of there as best as we can to be able to get the most kind of tender, juicy goodness. So again, if you do wrap your foil really tight, it does maintain that bark pretty well. Some of the times the pitfalls of doing the foil wrap on briskets and things and losing your bark is actually because you're leaving room for steam to gather. So if you get it good and tight, then you'll be able to avoid some of that. So, but I just basically do cotton gloves with some nitrile gloves on top of that. We're going to take our pork belly here, which looks amazing. Again, kind of what we were looking for is really well set bark. And as you start to push into it, the meat gives away quite a bit, so I can kind of stick my finger all the way in there. That kind of happens all the way around. So that is what you're looking for. In here, I'm just putting a little bit of kind of that initial rub that we used. Not a ton of it. I just want to sort of reinforce those flavors. This is just the herb mix, or the spice mix rather, not necessarily the salts and stuff. We should have plenty of salt on here. For the rest of that, we do want a little bit of moisture in here as well. I ended up just spritzing it with some grape juice. This is kind of what I had in the fridge. We do have some grape jelly as well in our basting mix, so that should kind of go nicely. We don't need to do way too much of it, maybe a 1/4 cup. Smells so freaking good. It smells like really nice smoked bacon right now. But I can smell that coriander and those cardamoms and everything in there as well. Kind of a bigger piece here, so maybe get a second piece of foil to wrap the other direction. So this is going to go back in the smoker. By the way, we've been maintaining about 275 degrees for most of this time. We'll throw this back in the smoker. It'll probably be done within about 2 hours from this stage. Join us back at that point. We'll get this thrown back on. All right, now we're going to actually make up our basting sauce. This is going to be the sauce that we're going to baste the pork belly with at the end of our cook. So we're actually starting with almost a 1/4 cup of bourbon. So this is going to be kind of a bourbon maple glaze with a little bit of an Asian hit to it. So after that, what I have in here, this is about two and a half tablespoons of ketchup, a tablespoon of Hoisin sauce, and a tablespoon of oyster sauce. We're just going to add that in there. Up next is barbecue sauce. This is about a quarter cup of a good sweet barbecue sauce. So just use something that's nice and sweet. We didn't really do anything sweet on the cooking process and the rub that went on with that. And so we're going to kind of sweeten it up at the end here and give it that nice savory, really good kind of bacony goodness inside, and then a little sweet jacket on the outside. So this is a grape jelly. Happens to be like a homemade grape jelly, but anything will do. Probably just a little bit less than a quarter of a cup, maybe a little over an eighth of a cup, something like that. And then this is a maple syrup. You don't have to go this fancy. This is just, I just don't keep any other maple syrup. Feel free to just use regular. This is actually a really nice bourbon barrel aged maple. If you haven't tried this stuff, by the way, on pancakes, waffles, whatever, it's amazing, and it's amazing in barbecue. So about the same amount that we did of the bourbon, about a quarter cup, maybe a little bit less than a quarter cup. That's going to go into there. In that, same kind of thing with the honey. About the same quantity of honey. It's just regular plain old honey. One thing to keep in mind with honey is it has a relatively low burning temperature where it'll actually start to burn, rather than caramelize. So just kind of keep that in mind anytime you're basting anything with honey. There are some types of honeys, if you really want to deep dive into it, that burn off a little bit higher temperature, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. This is a little bit of white pepper, probably not even quite a teaspoon, just kind of a little hit of that. And then this is a mixture, again, of fresh ground coriander and black pepper. That's like equal parts of that, and we're going to do a teaspoon into this. And then these are green cardamom, just magic little beans. These are whole beans. Again, if you just have ground stuff, that's just fine. With this, you want to give it like a little hit just to kind of break it up and wake it up. We're gonna, obviously, the whole thing is not gonna go and get basted on. They'll kind of get pulled out before the end, but that's basically it. We're gonna put this on the stove and let it come to a boil just to make sure everything combines really well. Okay, so our pork belly has reached an internal temperature of about 202 degrees. We're gonna pull it out. We've got some nice baked beans on here as well, and those are going to be lovely. So we're going to basically get straight to it. So get our foil off. The smell coming out of here is just unbelievable. Tender as can possibly be. It's basically like it's actually probably more kind of floppy than it was even when it was raw. So really, really nice. Anyway, what we're gonna do, I'm actually gonna flip it over, and if I can do it without it just falling apart, obviously that's a good sign. And then we've got our sauce here. We're going to do this a couple times. The bottom I'll probably just do the one time. You really just kind of need a little bit of that caramelization on there. This bottom side we're just kind of doing the flavor. And then I'm going to take this whole thing back over and put it on the grill like this as I flip it. If you had one of those giant spatulas, which I think I might, I'll have to go check. might be kind of nice for this kind of thing. I know I've got a pretty nice pizza peel that might work for this, but it's so tender at this point, it's just essentially falling it apart trying to transfer it. So be kind of gentle with your sauce. We don't want to totally mess up the bark that we worked with, or sorry, worked for. I'm not quite as worried about those low points on this part of it, but anyway, this is going to go for probably, got a duck under the umbrella here, probably about 15 to 20 minutes. And I will be basting about every 10 minutes of that. So we'll just kind of come out and check it, see how it looks, see if it's kind of caramelized up, and then do another basting as necessary. And then I'll just put it in this pan when we're done. Alright, so we're all done here. We've been basting this thing for about 20 minutes. About every, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes we basted it a little bit. To get all nice and caramelized. Now we're going to pull it off and slice it up. I'm going to scoop it with this thing because it was basically just falling apart before. As you can see, it's just super tender, fall apart, practically like pulled pork, but this is some serious bacony goodness. So anyway, I usually start just kind of slicing a chunk about this off of there, and then we're going to open that up. If you want to come and get a nice close-up of this, just to see how just amazing and juicy that looks. It's just totally full of rendered fat just spilling out of there. And then I kind of like them in strips, so once I get some manageable chunks about like this, it's kind of similar to brisket. It's nice if you kind of slice it against the grain, but this stuff is so tender you can cut pretty good little chunks of it like that. So there you are right there. Oh my hell. Wow. It's amazing. It's really freaking good. So that cardamom and coriander is just coming through really nice. And then that sweet glaze afterwards. Wow, it's just, it is amazing. Wow, this pork belly was super juicy, extremely tender, and just everybody that had it here at this party was extremely impressed with the flavor and the texture. Pork belly is just such an amazing, rich piece of meat. In a lot of ways, it's almost better to have a sort of like an extra meat or a second meat or side because of how rich the meat is. For this one, I ended up just slicing it up in these nice thick slices, and we just sort of had it plain with some sides. If you wanted to do pork belly burnt ends, the other option would be to cut like some 1.5 inch cubes here, put them in a bunch of extra rub, and then some sauce, and then throw them back on the smoker for another 20 to 30 minutes. I do recommend doing that as opposed to some of the other methods where you actually cube up the meat while it's raw and cook it. I feel like you get a lot better texture and a lot richer of a flavor if you cook it all together like this. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. And if you could, please give this a like and subscribe to my channel. I know I don't have a lot of subscriptions right now, but I am trying to upload a bunch of useful and helpful content. I know my videos can be a little bit long-winded, but I'm just trying to put in as many of my useful tips and things that I can in there to help beginners or even some pros. I've been doing this for a really long time. I do compete professionally and just love barbecue. I barbecue a couple of times at least every single week, and I just want to pass along some of that knowledge and some of the experience that I've gained from this.